Bet Sharukkin, the Son of Perdition, by Alan Bonk. Chapter 2. Contact. In 1968, in a field behind the church, 7 cautious young men seemed to appear from nowhere. They huddled around the large tree by the back border. At the center are 16-year-old Paul and Meriden. Meriden spoke up. "All right, boys, we don't have much time. Where's the new recruit?" An older teenager from the group stepped forward. "Welcome, brother. I am Meriden, and this is Paul." Meriden offered the older teenager a welcoming hand. The recruit received Meriden's hand and acknowledged Paul. Paul was smaller than the other guys, but is the most formidable. "Welcome. You are in the midst of a growing group of Assyrian men who wish to form a union to represent the Assyrian cause," Paul began. "Thank you for asking me," said the new recruit, but does not look at Paul in the eye. "Is something wrong?" asked Paul. "Well, if you don't mind, may I ask why we are meeting at the church?" "I'm not complaining, but I would assume the church would not exactly react kindly to hosting nationalists," answered the recruit. "Well, we're not exactly sanctioned. We're working hard behind the scenes, and to be clear, we see ourselves as a simple union organization that puts forth Assyrian views in public discourse," Meriden responded. "In short, to become a part of the government in Iran," Paul added. And all the boys began to chuckle. As the meeting continued, Father Yocana looked from the back door of the church. A young priest came up behind him and looked at the group of young men. "Do you want me to break up those misfits, Father?" the younger priest asked. "No. They're still part of our church, and their families are good people. We do not endorse their actions because it could bring another wave of persecution on us if the Muslims were to feel offended or threatened. This is not an unwarranted view. Don't you agree?" Father Yocana said. "Yes," the young priest replied, nodding his head. "So, let's pray that they don't get too zealous," Father Yocana said, and as he put his hands up and just walked away. The young priest shifted his attention back to Paul. The group noticed, and they dispersed and walked away discreetly. A few weeks later, Paul was at a communion service. Bells tolled and the service was over. Paul was leaving through the rear of the sanctuary. Suddenly he heard someone beckon to him from the corridor. It's the young priest. He went over to Paul apprehensively. "It's time for you to make contact, Paul," said the young priest. "Pardon me, Father, but with who?" Paul asked, confused. "Make an appointment with Father Ibrahim," the young priest added. "Father, have I done something to get in trouble?" Paul asked, worried. "You cannot tell anyone about this conversation or about the appointment to come. Do you understand? No one." The priest left Paul, nodding and wide-eyed. A week later, Paul, still in his school clothes, went to the monastery. The priest motioned for Paul to follow him through the stone corridors, deep into the building, like an ominous apparition. There were no windows, no sounds except their footsteps. The priest directed him to sit on a chair with a small table or altar in front of it. There were 8 monks wearing hoods just seated inside the back of the room, against the walls. There were 4 on each side of the room. Further in the room was the altar table. Father Ibrahim, a young priest, not much older than Paul, was directly on the other side of the table, facing Paul. He was the 9th and the only one without his hood on. Father Ibrahim nervously began. What I'm about to tell you must never be revealed to anyone outside this room. He continued, the heart of the matter is that not all priests in the Assyrian church are opposed to the new Assyria. He paused. This is because they are not Christians at all. We are priests that are under authority and oath to the old Assyrian god, named Asher. Father Ibrahim spoke as though this god had actually been talking with him. He continued, Asher is very much interested in restoring Assyria. He desires to put all his power and influence into seeing it done. Paul tried to keep a mocking smirk from forming. He recomposed himself and asked, how would I get this support? How would it come? Father Ibrahim simply put his finger on his lips. This shushed Paul. Look down and don't say anything. The father put his hood over his head and looked straight down. A great flash of light. 2 beings appeared next to Paul, 1 on each side. These entities were at least 7 feet tall, with 3 sets of wings. Their faces were like eagles, with large feathered combs on their heads, like Roman centurion helmets. Without a word, they reached out and touched Paul's shoulders. His whole body trembled and then paralyzed where he was. A second, even brighter light engulfed the room. Another supernatural being appeared, towering behind Father Ibrahim. Paul saw that Father Ibrahim shook through his robe. This man is terrified, Paul thinks. Paul goes on to describe what he saw as an angel. He was larger and only had 2 wings, but they stretched across the room. From the waist down, he was covered with feathers that were brightly colored like a peacock's and looked luminescent. It took a second for Paul to realize that the angel levitated above the floor, suspended in front of a large wheel of fire. The wheel moved and rotated as though it was alive. Actually, it is alive. The angel spoke to Paul directly, in perfect Aramaic, the language of Assyria. The angel said, Sharukkin Paul, I have come for you. Paul wanted to speak, but doesn't. I am Asher, chief god of Assyria, from time in the beginning. Paul felt a little pressure from the angels on his shoulder. I have chosen you. You will lead my Assyrian people back into their land, Sharukkin Paul. Paul whispered, Sharukkin Paul? He noticed Father Abraham flinch. Asher snapped at Paul. Silence! You don't know what your name even means, do you? Paul said nothing. Very smart. You can learn. Bet Sharukkin means the son of the legitimate king. From this point on, you will answer to that name when I call. I will make you the legitimate king, and you will be a son to me. Paul mouths to himself, "A king?" Asher continues, "You will never question my directions, my timing, or requests. You must be obedient without a reservation of mind, quick to act when needed, and patient to sit when told. I will choose your friends and your enemies. I will also give you full access to intelligence gathered by my ministers. I will fight every battle in the spirit before you engage the enemy. Father Ibrahim is your mentor. He will represent me. You can trust him. Do what he says." As fast as they came, the group of spiritual beings disappeared. They left the room so dark that Paul scarcely saw his hand in front of his face. As his eyes began to adjust, he saw that the hooded monks were all around him, on their knees, giving him their obeisance. Paul, shocked, "What are you doing? Stop it!" "Do you not know who you are? You are the son of Asher, the son of God, Bet Sharukkin," Father Ibrahim replied. "Do I have a choice?" Paul responded. Then he realized that he had not been asked anything, but rather told everything. "Will you really say no?" Father Ibrahim asked. "Well, I guess we have work to do," Paul said. Paul tossed and turned in bed that night. Asher's presence and words lingered in his mind. He got out of bed, up in a jolt. It took him a minute to compose himself, and he sighed. He sat at his desk and grabbed a pen and a tattered notebook from the drawer. He wrote, "I can still see this vision in my eyes awake. Every detail precise and complete. If this was a dream, the power of my mind and imagination is far greater than I ever thought. My mind is racing 100 miles an hour, but still, I can never share this with anyone else." He set the pen down and chuckled to himself at how ridiculous it all seemed. He ripped out the page he had just written, crumpled it up, and threw it away. That next Sunday, Paul went to church with his family. And as he came in through the door, he looked up to see a row of monks and priests in an alcove on his left side. He looked at them, and they made eye contact. Very discreetly, they closed their eyes and bowed their heads in unison to Paul. Paul's knees grew weak. He stumbled and nearly passed out. From that moment on, he knew that it had all been real. The contact, the call, were all real. End of chapter 2.